Alright, I will try my best to show you what I would like you to test. Because you're headed down the right path and you're in the right area, and the fact that you're looking at the fact that you're not getting spark from all the wires. What the fuck is this thing? Yes, right. So you're saying you're not getting a consistent spark across all wires. Well, the coil in the distributor is a dumb component. It just sits there and turns on when something else tells it to turn on. So I'm going to show you in my distributor what you should test and why you need an incandescent test lamp to do this. I suppose for this you could use an LED type test light, but honestly, if you don't have a test light and you're looking into getting one, just holy fucking shit. Why is this thing fucking tight? If you're looking into getting a test light and you don't have one yet, go ahead and get one, just the cheapies from Harbor Freight or O'Reilly's or wherever. Oh my god, what is going on with this thing? I hate this fucking cap. These caps are garbage, by the way. Don't ever buy these. They're fucking plastic. It's so brittle from being under the hood. They're kind of nice to look at first, and I thought they were kind of cool, but they're not. They're dumb. So, in the actual fuck? Oh my god. Did I put this thing together? I don't fucking understand why this shit is so difficult. There we go. So if you're watching to this point, so far I've got the cap off, which has been a journey in itself for some fucking reason. And if you don't have this done already, go ahead and take the little tiny cover that covers the guts out of the distributor. And then you can go ahead and put the rotor back on. Definitely need the rotor back on so you can kind of figure out where the distributor is angled and roughly at which position the rotor would be pointing towards on the cap. So this thing's sitting on the car, cap's on, right? And I got my wires numbered here, so 1, 3, 4, 2 in firing order. When the rotor, this is actually kind of good that you can see this, when the rotor contact point is pointing toward number 1, roughly in there somewhere, you should get a spark. And when it'll move, and you're going to get another spark, and it'll move, another spark, another spark. That's what you would expect if the distributor is working properly. So, roughly every 90 degrees, you should get a spark, at least one spark. So 90, another 90, another 90, another 90. You should get 4 pulses of this coil per revolution while you're cranking. And here's your coil leads right here. The coil is nice and not numbered, but like tells you the polarity, positive and negative in there. Positive lead, plus sign, negative lead, negative sign. The coil should be getting power at all times. Yes, the coil should be getting power at all times when the key's on or when you're trying to start. That'll be on 100%. This negative lead is what the igniter, the ignition control module is turning on. So coil has power on all the time, or 12 volts added all the time, and then negative is pulsed to this coil from the ignition control module. The ignition control module gets its signal from the ECU. The feedback sensors in the distributor tell the engine ECU where in the rotation it is, so it knows how to time the coil turn on and off appropriately. As long as the ECU is getting good feedback from all of the rotation sensors, your TDC sensor, your CYP, so on and so forth, if all of those are correct, then the ECU should be receiving those signals, processing them correctly, and then controlling the ignition control module output. And the ignition control module, all it is a big transistor. Think of a transistor like a relay. Transistor sitting there, and it's basically directing ground to the coil. But all it needs is a small voltage signal to turn it on. So the tiny little pulses the ECU sends it are the on signal processing. So ECU is going to pulse the ignition control module with a low voltage signal. And that turns the bigger transistor on. The big ends of the transistor, the parts that carry the load, are ground switching. So when the ignition control module turns on, it's actually sending ground to the coil. And when the ECU wants to turn the ignition control module off, it takes that power pulse away, cuts ground off from the coil. So what you need to do, when you have this all open and stuff, and you can go ahead and take your distributor cap and all that stuff off the car, and it'll be sitting on the edge of your car like this. And just be very, very, very careful. Your coil tower. Stay away from your coil tower while you're doing this. But get you a test light. This is my incandescent test lamp, and it's obviously not going to work on this bench like this. But just take your lead right here and clip it to your battery positive. Clip it on battery positive, so that way whenever you touch a ground surface, the light bulb turns on. So clip to battery. Once you clip to battery, you want to get a buddy to kind of help you with this. And you're going to go ahead and take the test light, staying as far away from the coil tower as you can, and you're going to go to the negative. Or if you wanted to avoid that danger right there, you can actually remove this lead, the negative lead, from the coil itself, and just let it sort of hang off to the side. That will keep the coil from turning on, so you won't have 50 to 60,000 volts coming out of this guy. If you get your hand near it or something like that. But if you're not experienced with trying to do this, just take that lead off, and then take the test light, and then just touch that ground wire coming off the ignition control module. When the engine starter is turning the distributor, every rotation, for every 90 degrees of a turn, you should see the light bulb blink once. You want to make sure that for every 360 degrees of rotation, you're getting 4 blinks. If you're getting 4 blinks, that means the coil is turning on or off 4 times. And if you're not getting spark out of the wires, even though you verified that this coil is being turned on and off 4 times, then one of two things are going on. Either you've got a connection problem between coil tower and the distributor, or between the rest of the distributor and the rotor, or the rotor to the coil towers and coil towers to the spark plugs, or so on and so forth. That path. If you verify that this coil is being pulsed 4 times, and you feel you have good, nice hot blue spark, that's another thing to look for too. Which you can do, you can actually test the coil output using an incandescent test lamp. Go ahead and switch your ground lead, or this, your clip on your test light. Go to ground, battery ground, or chassis ground, doesn't matter. You can literally clip it to the ear on the distributor while you're doing this test. And have a buddy crank the car. Connect your negative lead back to the coil if you've taken this off. And then you're going to go near the coil tower, but you're not going to touch it. You want to have a gap present, at least half an inch to an inch. When your buddy cranks the car, you'll see a spark jump that gap. And, yes, this is 50 to 60,000 volts, but it's very low current, and it will not damage the incandescent lamp in any way. I've used this technique hundreds and hundreds of times, and it is one of the best diagnostic tools if you don't have like a spark gap tester. This is super, super convenient. Just create that gap, have your buddy crank the car over, and watch the output of the coil. So for every 90 degrees of rotation here, you're going to get one pulse. You should get one spark. Have that gap there, between half an inch and an inch. You should get 4 sparks jumping that gap for every 360 degrees of distributor rotation. If you're not, then something is either not allowing this ignition control module to turn on, in which case you'll probably need an oscilloscope to see that, because the voltage control output switches. I can't remember what the actual voltage is that turns this guy on, but to be able to see that square wave turn this ignition control module on, it's very, very difficult to see with a meter, and you can't use a test light to do it. You may be able to use a logic probe, and that's a case where an LED test light might be better for that, for signals coming out of the ECU. The ECU lead that controls the ignition control module. If you took your LED test lamp and touched that, that's going to be a positive voltage signal. It's going to go from ground, from 0 volts, up to some sort of voltage. So if you have an LED test light, you need to make sure that it can turn on and off at a low voltage, because it shouldn't cross the 5 or the 8 volt threshold. So if the LED can't turn on with at least 8 volts, then you may need to get yourself a logic probe or try to find an oscilloscope. You can get logic probes as well from tool distributors, places like that. All a logic probe is basically a tiny little circuit board that controls 2 LEDs, and you literally power the whole thing with power and ground going to like a battery source, a common battery source in the car. And when this is powered on and you're not touching anything, there's no lights on inside this thing. When you touch ground, when this thing is connected to the battery, when you touch any kind of ground source, it will turn green. When you touch any kind of power source, it will turn red. And the logic probe will turn on with very, very low voltages, either positive or negative. And so this is a good tool for testing something like the ECU pulse to the ignition control module. So there are a few tools you may or may not have that you might need to properly diagnose this thing, especially if you're not getting you're either testing the spark output at the coil. If you're not getting 4 sparks, you need to check for pulse. If you're not getting 4 ground pulses to this coil at this terminal right here, then you're going to have to go a little bit further and get a logic probe. You need to make sure that the signal coming from the ECU, and this is why an oscilloscope is really handy to have, because it allows you to see the waveform as to whether or not the waveform is distorted. Maybe it's shorted, or maybe it's nipping ground somewhere. I don't know. Maybe the signal isn't as clean as having a good intact wire. You might have a wire that's rubbing somewhere or something like that, interrupting that signal. But if you verify circuit integrity on that wire that's supposed to pulse this ignition control module, then the ECU is either bad itself, or it's not receiving the rotation sensor signals in the distributor that it's looking for. And again, that is another thing that you can only really test with an oscilloscope, to make sure that all of your cylinder position, or all of the AC sine wave generators in here, all the pulse generators for cylinder position and crankshaft speed and all that, the only way to test whether or not those waveforms are actually making it to the ECU is to honestly use an oscilloscope. So And this is what, man, it kind of sucks that professional tech wouldn't take a look at it because it's modded. This is not rocket science. This is like super basic stuff that most techs should be able to do, most good diagnostic techs. Having a good solid understanding of what these things are expecting and what the signals look like is the key to diagnosing this properly. But you also need to have the tools to be able to visually see a lot of those things. So hopefully this video gave you a little bit more of a path to take. Easy things to check. You can check to make sure your coil is getting pulsed the proper time, and that the maybe coil output and the spark condition look good as well. But if you're not getting 4 pulses to this coil, either on the primary side, the 12 volt side of the coil, or the secondary side of the coil, the high voltage tower, if you're not getting 4 pulses out of this thing, or either to it or out of it, then the ECU is either not turning this ignition control module on, or ICM is bad, or something. It's just the daisy chain of events. This thing only gets turned on by ICM. ECU turns on the ICM when it wants to, based on the rotation sensor feedback from this thing. But if the ECU doesn't get that sensor feedback, if it can't tell where it's at, then it's not going to try to pulse the coil. If the ECU is getting everything it needs to pulse that coil from the distributor and it's still not pulsing, then either the ECU is not turning on the ignition control module, or maybe the signal wire's got something going, that maybe the ICM signal control wire is got something going on with it. Circuit integrity isn't good. But hopefully this helped you, maybe, sort of, kind of. But yeah, just keep us posted on what you find, and we'll be more than willing to help you.